firm with a fresh perspective. I'm joined here by my colleague Chris Dykes, and what we want to talk today about is earnouts. In our prior video we talked about vendor finance and that concept in a little bit more detail. Today we want to talk about earnouts, which is sort of the cousin of vendor finance, same but different, as they say. And I did ask you in the previous video to explain the difference between the two, but probably be a benefit in explaining very briefly what vendor finance is, what an earnout is, and then we'll go into earnouts in a little bit more detail.
Yeah, certainly. So as we touched on in the last video, how they're similar is that the vendor is agreeing that a portion of the purchase price is going to be paid post-settlement. So the vendor's not getting all of the full purchase price on settlement date, but a portion of it is going to be paid out post-settlement. Vendor finance structure is where a set sum, agreed sum that's going to be paid, and there might be interest obligations on that, but it's the balance of the purchase price that's going to be secured. Whereas earnout, which we're going to be focusing on today, the balance of the purchase price is adjusted based on the performance of the purchasing company. So the business is taken over by the purchaser. It's going to go through a performance period. There's going to be a set obligations in terms of how to determine that earn-out portion that the vendor is still going to earn, and that is linked to performance of the business in various ways.
Great. So when a vendor is selling their business, why would they consider offering a purchaser an earn-out?
Yeah, so earn-out, similar to vendor finance, it's a means of a vendor securing perhaps a better purchase price than they would have got if without it. So, if the market's not there where there's interest at the price that the vendor's looking for, earn-out is a way to close that gap, so a vendor can potentially get more. A vendor that's going for an earn-out option is confident in the performance of the business. So because it's linked with the purchaser taking over and performing, and going to be the performance, the payout that's going to ultimately the vendor is going to receive on that portion is based on performance. A vendor goes, well, I know this business is good and this business will be good if someone takes it over, and therefore I'm willing to do that, and I'm confident that I'm going to get that little bit more extra by offering it through the earn-out.
So it could work well if it's a business that hasn't been trading for many years, and so it doesn't have the trading history to give a purchaser that sort of confidence, but there is strong growth. And the vendor's sort of saying, look, I back that the strong growth and turnover is sustainable, and so it sort of de-risks the position, I guess, a little bit for the purchaser, because the purchaser goes, well, I'm not paying on the hope that it's going to continue to perform as well as it is, and the vendor's saying, well, I'm backing myself. How does a vendor sort of get to terms with that sort of handing control of the business over on settlement? And portion of the purchase price is contingent on sort of future performance, but that performance is out of their hands. Do vendors sometimes stay in the business in some capacity to kind of help things along there?
So it's certainly case by case, but as you've alluded to there, is that the vendor has interest in the performance of the business, and for the vendor to step out completely would be saying to the purchaser, well, I'm confident in the business, but and you go run it. But typically a vendor will want to have some say in it, or some interest or some guiding hand in the process. So often with a earn-out provisions, there's also discussion about having the vendor stay on in terms of being an independent contractor or something like that, or advisor, or in terms of which the vendor assistance period is often extended beyond the typical period that's catered for in the agreements, so that the vendor can be involved and assist the purchaser in ensuring a success. And as you spoke about now, it's earlier, for a purchaser, it gives a lot of confidence in terms of what I'm buying, the vendor's backing, and it is also a very nice way of ensuring that you are going to make a success of it, because the vendor has, and the vendor's now going to walk the road with you until that earn-out is done, or a portion of the earn-out period, which is going to be really good for them.
Yeah. Okay. No, that's really good. So the structure in terms of the earn-out, the calculation of what the earn-out's normally is expressed as a percentage of, I'd say, profit, normally, not turnover.
Yeah.
And how does a vendor ensure that a purchaser doesn't manipulate the profit to make it look less than it actually is?
Yeah, that's very good. Yeah. So yes, it's usually, as you say, profit. I mean, you could link it to any performance basis, but vendor wants to be able to determine, the parties want to be able to determine the legitimacy of it and what is actually being made. And the provisions in the agreement would cater for specifically normalisation of accounts, so making sure that
the purchaser doesn't introduce new
expenses or so fictitious, but charges or expenses that cut the profitability, which ultimately then would affect the earn-out of the vendor. So rigorous provisions around how the accounts are to be handled and determined, and provisions on how to determine the earn-out and object to or review those numbers by the vendor if not agreed to, need to be catered for and detailed in the agreement.
Yeah, I mean, as an example, is sometimes purchaser be looking to aggressively expand the business, so therefore they will acquire a lot more sort of capital into the business and plant and small plant and machinery, and we need to look at sort of normalising that out, because really the vendor shouldn't be paying for the purchaser gearing the business for sort of future profit, but it's that sort of current profit during the earn-out period. What sort of period do you normally see as a typical earn-out period?
Typically, I guess from my experience, we see anywhere between 1 to 3 years, and I guess averaging out on 2 is quite usual.
Yeah. And when you're advising a vendor or a purchaser around the due diligence aspect of, from an earn-out perspective, what would you be advising your vendor and what would you be advising your purchasers is an important consideration around offering the earn-out and considering the other party?
Yeah. So as a vendor, similar to the vendor finance structure, is that a vendor is dependent on the purchaser performing and making sure the business performs well, more so than even I would say in terms of vendor finance, because the earn-out will fluctuate based on the success of the business. So you want to make sure it has the utmost success, so you get your full earn-out payout. And for that reason, you want to make sure that you have confidence in the purchaser of the abilities and skills to perform.
So the background, their experience.
Yeah. Are the right person to take over your business or not, and not just is this the person that's going to be willing to buy my business? So it's a crucial one to have a look at and be comfortable with. The other one is to making sure that you've obtained both legal and tax advice to determine whether the earn-out is going to be treated differently and how that's going to affect you ultimately, your bottom line in terms of potential tax payable.
Yeah, that's quite right, because normally on a business sale, the capital purchase price is tax-free from a vendor's perspective. Obviously, confirming you're not sort of overpaying on or over receiving on tangible assets and having sort of accrued depreciation pullback there. But subject to that, normally it's tax-free in the hands of the vendor. But from an earn-out perspective, sometimes not, and quite right, you need to talk to the accountant to make sure the form of it sits right with the vendor from a tax perspective.
Absolutely, yeah. And then to answer your question in relation to the purchaser, again, it's determining then, are you comfortable with the price that you're paying, because you're going to have an additional obligation to pay post-settlement a portion of the purchase price. Are you going to be able to meet those obligations in addition to your commitments to the bank or the lending structures that you have got, as well as the other debts and obligations of the business, and being comfortable that the business is in fact going to be able to perform. Ultimately, for both parties, it's the best interest for the business to perform, because while the purchaser will have to pay the vendor out the full earn-out if they do succeed, that means the purchaser is making more money, the business is doing well, and that's good for both parties.
I've sometimes seen in transactions where they have a formula for the earner, let's say 3 times EBITDA, or 3 times GP, but they've got a sort of a cap and collar clause, so to speak, so meaning that notwithstanding the performance, the earn-out won't be less than or more than, to kind of give the parties some certainty as well. Have you seen a lot of that?
Yeah, that's the typical structure, and it's generally what the parties will agree to. Ultimately, the vendor is selling the business and saying, well, this is how much I want to get out, this portion is earn-out, so usually that's going to be the cap of saying, well, this is how much you were expecting to get, and this is the earn-out cap if the performance is achieved, but nothing above that. And there's generally a earn-out minimum as well, to say, well, if the business hasn't performed as expected, it's gone below the minimum, and therefore the vendor's getting nothing out in terms of earn-out, so there's a zero pay for that. And then anything in between, it'll be based on a formula. So again, depending how you do those clauses, provide for that in the agreement, it will cater for what's the mechanism and amount that we pay to the vendor of that earn-out provision. So a minimum of 0 to the max of the actual balance of purchase price, and anywhere in between based on performance of the business.
So it'd be good for a purchaser to have that cap, because if the purchaser goes in and makes a real success of it and aggressively grows the business and the profitability, he's not going to be basically lining the vendor's pockets unnecessarily. Yeah,
he's not intending to have a partner in the business that's going to profit from the growth. The structure is intended to have the vendor get a payout of what is agreed to, based on a protection of having a mechanism to determine, well, if I do succeed, you'll get out what we agreed to. If we don't succeed, you're going to get slightly less, and if we really don't succeed, you're going to get nothing.
So we touched on it a little bit earlier. I think it's important that the parties have mechanisms in the agreement to cover a situation where there is a difference in opinion around the calculation of the GP or the EBITDA, depending on the formula used. And so what are sort of the typical clauses you'd see around dispute resolution or the calculation, or let's say differences in opinion around the calculation to sort of work through that dispute?
Yeah, so there'll be some catering for opportunity for the financials to be produced by the purchaser, being operating the company, for the vendor to have an opportunity to peruse and challenge them, and have the purchaser then opportunity to review that and respond. If there's still disagreement, then you can provide for different types of methods in terms of determination, be that an objective third party in terms of being agreed to and appointed by the parties from the outset, or your other dispute resolution mechanisms in terms of determination. Because should be a calculation-based matter, an independent third party, or a mechanism where each party appoints someone and there's a final determination if need be, should be a sufficient means of determining those numbers, because it is generally based on a calculation of numbers, and therefore there's not necessarily a debate or discussions around how it should be figured out. It's more about making sure that they've got it right. Notwithstanding, there could always be a little bit of argument of what's normalised and what should be deducted or excluded or not.
Yeah. Okay, so sometimes it may end up in arbitration. I mean, that's few and far between. Most of the time the parties can work it out between themselves. And I've also seen sometimes that they have a clause in that says that let's say the ADLS, the Law Society, or the certain accounting profession would have the ability to appoint this independent party that makes a final and binding decision. The benefit of that is it avoids the cost of arbitration. Both parties need to understand they'll be sort of bound by that party's decision. Yeah. Do vendors normally take security when they offer an earn-out?
So generally the answer is no, so it's not typically seen, but it is an interesting question because as when we discuss vendor finance, you'll often find that vendors would want, or it's important and recommended that they obtain some form of security. We mentioned GSAs, general security agreements, and personal indemnities and guarantees from the purchaser. So it's a bit, I guess it's not common with an earn-out provision, but the risk is still there because ultimately the vendor is relying on the purchaser paying a portion of the purchase price post-settlement, and there'll be nothing preventing the vendor from negotiating a form of security to ensure payment, and that would probably take the similar structure, having a general security agreement over the assets of the business and potentially a personal guarantee and indemnity from the individuals behind the purchasing entity.
So I hope that's been informative for you today and you understand a little bit more about earn-outs. If you have any questions around earn-outs, feel free to get in contact with either Chris or myself and we'd be happy to answer your questions. Thank you.